Hello, everybody, and welcome to this year's annual MScCCAFS Student Symposium. My name is Professor Charles Spann. I'm the Director of the Master's Programme in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security here at NUI Galway. We'd like to welcome you all and particularly welcome our students who are about to give presentations on the various projects that they've been doing over the year. This year, we've had a really wonderful, highly enthusiastic and talented class who, despite the COVID challenges, have done really excellently engaged with the program and also done superb projects. I suppose reflecting the diversity of student backgrounds, interests, and also our global partner network, the students have really done excellent research projects, and this year we've placed an emphasis on based on the people that the program generates and what they go on to do in terms of their work in climate change, agriculture and food security. As this year's class are now finishing their time with us, we wish them well for the future, and we do encourage them as alumni of the program to keep in contact with us and also with their classmates as a general kind of network. We'd also like to welcome our incoming MScCCAFS class, whom we look forward to meeting over the next while and engaging with the program and as the program begins for this academic year. We do hope that you enjoy the presentations at this year's symposium and that there'll be some research findings of interest to you. So at that, I'll hand you all over to the students and you can see the excellent research that they've been doing. Thank you.
Hello everyone. My name is Mwape Moses Katasa. I am a crop scientist working for the Ministry of Agriculture in Zambia under the Extension Services. I wish to humbly welcome you to my MSc in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Research Project presentation. The title for my project was Productivity Differentials Between Adopters and Non-Adopters of Climate Smart Agriculture CSA Practices amongst smallholder farmers in northern Ghana. I would like to start my presentation by looking at the effects of climate change on agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. The adverse effects of climate change and variability on the sustainability of smallholder farming systems in sub-Saharan Africa cannot be overstated. In sub-Saharan Africa, climate change and variability have continued to be a major challenge to the attainment of food security, and this is mainly due to the increased incidences of high temperatures, unstable rainfall patterns, and low adoption of the recommended farming technologies by the smallholder farmers. Additionally, IPCC 2018 highlighted that climate variability and change are already negatively affecting ecosystems, people, and many livelihoods throughout the world. Coming to Ghana, the situation is the same. The impact of climate change on agriculture are mainly due to increasing surface temperatures, unstable rainfall, extended dry periods, and delayed onset of the rains in a number of regions. Ama et al. 2011. Arising from the numerous challenges posed by climate change, climate smart agriculture has been proposed as one of the best options that we can use to address such challenges. According to FAO 2013, climate smart agriculture is an approach that has basically three important objectives. One, to sustainably increase agricultural productivity and incomes at farm level in order to foster food security and general development. Two, adapting and enhancing resilience against climate change at all levels, starting from farm, national, regional, and global levels. Three, reduction of greenhouse gases emissions from all forms of farming activities. Di Facco and Veronesi 2013 reported that among the CSA practices that have been implemented are planting of new crop varieties, growing of drought-tolerant crops, planting of different crops, changing of planting dates, use of weather index crop insurance, use of irrigation, and adopting of water and soil conservation technologies. Therefore, the main objective for my research was to determine the productivity differentials between the adopters and non-adopters of CSA practices amongst the smallholder farmers in Jirapa and rural districts of Ghana. The specific objective was to identify the main determinant for the adoption of CSA practices. One of the most common CSA practices in West Africa is the making of the Zai and Half Moon techniques. The Zai and Half Moon techniques, they have got three functions. One, they serve as places where the seed is placed when planting. Two, the organic matter from plant and animal sources are placed here to provide nutrition to the crops. Three, they serve as water harvesting points within the plots. That is how a sorghum crop looks like. It bears panicles at the top. The panicles contain seeds which are threshed for human consumption. To carry out my research, a survey was conducted in Jirapa and rural districts of northern Ghana, and 210 smallholder farmers were randomly sampled. A multi-topic questionnaire comprising 12 modules was administered through person-to-person interviews. The data which was collected was analyzed using SPSS version 27 software. The results from our study showed that there was no significant difference between the yields of sorghum per hectare between adopters and non-adopters of CSA practices at p-value less than 0.05. A sorghum crop is known to be tolerant to biotic stress factors like drought, and also this crop is able to grow well even under poor soils where other cereals like maize fail to grow. Mofokeng and Shaggy 2016. Further, our study found that experience in farming is the main determinant for adoption of CSA practices. Our results correlate with findings by Oneke 2017, who found that the number of years that a farmer had spent in growing rice had positively resulted in increased adoption of good practices like nursery planting, early transplanting, and fertilizer application. Also, our findings are in accordance with Obisesa in 2014, who found in a related study that the more years of experience in cassava production, the more the increase in the adoption levels of improved cassava production practices by smallholder farmers in Nigeria. In terms of plant nutrition, the study found that the CSA adopters were using more of manure and organic fertilizers than the non-CSA adopters. The non-CSA adopters were using more of synthetic inorganic fertilizers. I would like to conclude that the adoption of CSA practices did not give any yield advantage to sorghum producers in the context of our study. Future studies should address specific reasons why there is no productivity differences between CSA adopters and non-CSA adopters under sorghum production in the study area. Also, policy actions should be taken to ensure effective provision of extension services to less experienced farmers in order to boost the adoption rates of CSA practices as the approach is known to have multiple benefits. I would like to sincerely thank my NUI supervisors, who include Professor Charles Spillane and Dr. Peter McKeown and Dr. Hona. I would like also to thank the host institution, which is Research Mali, and specifically Dr. Abdullahi Jido for providing the datasets and also for guiding me in the data analysis. I would like also to thank Irish Aid for awarding me a scholarship under the Irish Fellows. Finally, I would like to thank the Ministry of Agriculture for allowing me to attend this important course. Thank you everyone for listening.
Hello and welcome to the MScCCAFS Annual Conference. My name is Kasonda Betha and I'm a CCAFS student for the 2020-2021 intake. My research topic is Gender and Influences on Climate-Smart Agriculture Adaptation in Malawi. The research was conducted under the umbrella of the 3D4 Agriculture Development Program in the Plant and Agri-Biosciences Centre, National University of Ireland, Galway. Climate-smart agriculture uptake and trends in sub-Saharan Africa. Predicted impacts of climate change on biophysical agricultural inputs such as soils, irrigation water, as well as plant growth indicate severe effects on global food security. This is a region that is dependent mostly on agriculture. Hence, the widespread of climate-smart agriculture in these regions is pertinent. Initiatives by international organizations as well as stakeholders are underway to scale out climate-smart agriculture. One example is that of the Africa CSA Alliance, which is targeting approximately 6 million smallholder farmers by 2021. Climate-smart agriculture is an approach that is being used to transform and reorient agricultural systems to support food security under the new realities of climate change. Factors influencing CSA adoption in Malawi. CSA uptake faces a myriad of hindrances, among them socioeconomic, institutional, or climate-related. These factors can also originate externally or internally. Examples include age, social status, level of education, and gender. Gender in particular has been studied on how it can hinder the uptake of CSA. In Malawi, a study was conducted and there were gender disparities that were found to have existed in accessing farm inputs. Now, gender is being utilized in the context of being male or female, or masculinity and femininity. In CSA uptake, in the sub-Saharan Africa, gender mainstreaming is quite crucial. This study was conducted in Malawi's Zole Traditional Authority of Dowa District in central Malawi. The research was focusing on trying to find out who provides climate-smart agriculture practices, who makes the decision to adopt the provided CSAs, who provides the work for the adopted climate-smart agriculture practices, as well as who benefits from these practices. The practices were grouped into 4 groups. These practices were looking at soil management. They were also looking at increasing production as well as energy saving. The research methodology that was utilized were a survey that was conducted using focus group discussions and interviews from the existing Village Savings and Loans Association groups. These groups were originally set up under the Care Pathways program. In the study, we utilized 91 VSL groups comprising of 992 farmers. Also, a portfolio of 59 CSA practices was compiled from a CCAFS compendium, the Malawi CSA Alliance, and the Care Pathways program. Our research findings for the supporters or providers of CSA in Malawi revealed that the CSA practices and technologies are supported largely by governments, for example, fertilizer imports. The results also indicate that energy saving, such as improved cookstoves, were also provided by governments. However, local companies as well as NGOs were also have stated to have provided some of the practices such as recommended varieties. On the decision-making aspect, the findings revealed that households are the sole decision makers for soil management practices such as conservation agriculture, use of manure, etc. when given an opportunity. However, from the focus group discussions, it was highlighted that men had a higher bargaining power when making the decision to adopt climate-smart agriculture practices. For example, the adoption of conservation agriculture, men had an upper hand to make the decision in using or adopting conservation agriculture. In answering the question on who provides the work for the adopted CSA, our research established that men and women jointly provide the work for some of the practices such as conservation agriculture and fertilizer input. However, some of the practices such as use of ridges or making ridges in crop fields, men were found to have had a higher score compared to women. There were also practices such as making of improved cookstoves. Women were found to have had a higher score compared to men, boys, and girls. Now, these highlight some of the gender roles that are attached to the uptake of certain CSA practices. Based on our research findings, we conclude that gender does play a critical role in the uptake of CSA in Malawi and in sub-Saharan Africa. Gender mainstreaming in the scale-out of CSA practices in projects is crucial, and therefore the value of this study lies in recommending projects and programs in scaling out CSA to 1. Consider the constraints that are proving as hindrances in accessing resources, finances, as well as access to inputs in climate-smart agriculture adaptation. Projects and programs should consider the needs, priorities, and preferences of both men and women for equitable and inclusive outcomes. It is also recommended that projects and programs should incorporate men and women at all project stages, starting from project design, implementation, even post-project implementation stages for effective CSA uptake, as well as climate-smart agriculture adaptation. I would like to thank and acknowledge the NUI Galway supervisors, Professor Charles Spillane, Dr. Una Murray, Dr. Peter McKeown, and Mr. Decolius Kalumo for the work done and the supervision that was provided throughout this research. I would also like to recognize the funders of this project, as well as my studies, the Irish Aid, the 3D4 Agriculture Development Program, CARE International, as well as SEED. I would like to thank everybody for listening in and attending. Thank you very much. These are some of the materials that were utilized in this study. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Robin Lyons, and my MScCCAFS 2021 research project looked at agri-food waste valorization using anaerobic digestion to close loops in sustainable agri-food systems. An agri-food system will supply safe, readily available and affordable food to diverse consumers globally while also supporting producers. Current agri-food systems cause great stress to the environment and negatively affect the health of people. Transformation of the current food and land use systems is needed to meet targets set out within the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. The adoption of a circular economy model within agri-food systems will assist in the reuse and recycling of resources. Closed-loop systems are at the center of circular economies, making use of feedback loops. Nutrients can be returned back to the site of food production, protecting nutrient cycles and reducing need for chemical fertilizer production. This study focused on anaerobic digestion, a natural process carried out by bacteria in the absence of oxygen. Anaerobic digestion can be exploited for waste treatment in large vessels known as digesters. Agri-food wastes such as manure and food waste are suitable feedstocks for anaerobic digestion and are reduced by bacteria, producing nutrient-rich digestate and biogas as outputs. Anaerobic digestion can be carried out at a large scale to treat industrial wastes or a small scale treating farm or community wastes. Digestate can then be used as a fertilizer, while biogas can produce electricity. To carry out this literature review, literature was studied on topics of anaerobic digestion, circular economy, and the closing of loops with a focus on agri-food systems. The literature was compiled from Google Scholar using a range of search strings. Focus was placed on agri-food waste and its feasibility as feedstock for an anaerobic digester. Biogas plants are well developed in many European countries, mostly creating combined heat and power from waste. Germany is a leader in the field with over 10,000 biogas plants, mostly from small-scale sites. Production of biomethane is also increasing in Germany. Anaerobic digestion is underdeveloped in countries such as Ireland, where high livestock numbers hold large potential for emissions reductions through treatment of manure. Literature agrees that co-digestion of feedstocks was advantageous, helping to stabilize conditions within digesters. When digested alone, swine manure can create high levels of ammonia, leading to low biogas yields. Financial barriers are a major factor in the adoption of anaerobic digestion for waste treatment. Anaerobic digesters are expensive equipment and financing is needed for installation costs. Financial supports differ globally, and the International Energy Agency found that support systems influence the way in which biogas is utilized. Feed-in tariffs encourage the use of biogas to produce electricity, while tax exemptions favor the use of biogas as a transport fuel. Financial supports have increased the injection of biomethane into the gas grid in the UK, France, Denmark, and Sweden. Instability within digesters can cause inhibition of biogas production. This can happen when there is a buildup of volatile fatty acids or ammonia, disrupting microbial communities. Anaerobic digestion of agri-food waste creates renewable energy in the form of methane-rich biogas. Biogas can be used to create heat and electricity for digester needs and power local areas. When CO2 is removed from biogas, biomethane is left, which can directly replace natural gas within the gas grid and can also replace natural gas in vehicles and help power large heavy goods vehicles, replacing fossil fuels. To conclude, anaerobic digestion is a suitable waste valorization method to close loops within agri-food systems. Literature highlighted how anaerobic digestion systems can treat a versatile feedstock, reducing waste volume while creating a nutrient-dense digestate and methane-rich biogas. The treatment of manure and food waste reduces greenhouse gas emissions from storage and other waste treatment methods such as incineration and landfill. Anaerobic digestion also produces renewable gas, which is essential as we strive to decarbonize. The market for renewable energy is only set to increase. The demand for both agricultural products and renewable energies is set to increase. The management of crop nutrients into the future is imperative to protect food security. Policies such as the Renewable Energy Directive and Fuel Quality Directive will increase the need for biofuels, boosting biogas industries treating agricultural waste products. Financial aid is important to maintain progression of biogas industries and to encourage farmers to better manage agricultural wastes while producing renewable energy. I would like to thank my NUI Galway supervisors, Professor Charles Spillane and Dr. Peter McKeown, for their help with this project. I would also like to thank my MScCCAFS colleagues, friends and family for their support throughout this project also. Thank you.
Hi everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Peter McKeown and I'm the coordinator of the MScCCAFS. Over the last few years, this program has grown to be quite successful and to produce graduates who have gone on to have careers in many walks of life all around the world. We're particularly proud of the fact that our students have been able to benefit from interdisciplinary training, which provides them with the skills that we need to face up to all the sort of challenges that humanity is going to have to get to grips with in agriculture and in global food security. And these require new ways of thinking and interdisciplinary approaches. We like to think that we're able to learn from each other, and we're very happy that a number of our alumni have come back to also teach into our course in later years, as well as continuing to collaborate with faculty and collaborators to research and publish. This is particularly evident in the course projects, which are generally based with partner organisations, such as those connected with the International Agricultural Research Institutes of CGIAR, in partner organisations in Europe, in Ireland, in many different sorts of institutions. And our aim is that every student produces something which is publishable, useful, not just a thesis, but also something that makes a real impact. And over the last few years, we've been developing what has been termed a theory of change about how we actually hope to see the course producing graduates and levering networks and developing skills that actually do, in one way or another, make a difference. That's what we're about. As well as our connections with CG, we're also very happy to have the continued support of Irish Aid, who help to provide scholarships for students to come to Ireland and study from many of the countries who are facing the brunt of climate change related crises. Please follow us for the latest news on our Twitter handle and keep in touch with us. And welcome to those students who are arriving, and it's great to see all of the work from the students who are just completing their projects. We're really proud of you. As I say, our theory of change is that you go out and actually make a difference, and we really enjoyed learning from you and from benefiting from your insights and experiences. It's been, as we all know, a very particular year, and it continues to be challenging times, but you've really risen to the occasion brilliantly. And thank you for all of that. And thanks to everyone for listening. Cheerio.
Hi, my name is Enda McAvoy, and I'm from the MScCCAFS, and this paper focuses on city regional approaches for sustainable transitions of food systems. Cities are poised to be at the front line of the fight against climate change. So, at present, more than 50% of the world's population live in cities, and this is expected to grow to 66% by 2050. And this shift in population towards urbanisation has brought with it a shift in economic activity, and it's one of the predominant forces shaping food systems today. With increase in decentralised networks and fewer individual actors supplying an increasing proportion of produce, primarily meat and dairy and processed foods, to cities. And this shift in population has brought new economic, social, political and environmental tensions, including increased migration, biodiversity challenges and imbalances between private and public interests, both rural and urban. Despite the increase in urbanisation, urban areas remain dependent on rural areas, both globally and locally, for the provision of, like, amongst other things, food, water and energy, labour and natural services, and also conversely, power and capital in urban areas drive change in rural areas. So, enhancing interconnectedness and development of urban-rural linkages can provide a framework to tackling global food system and nutrition challenges, amongst other challenges. A city-region approach aims to strengthen food value chains, linking urban centres and consumers to farmers in rural hinterlands. So, now this city-region food system approach aims to increase access to food and generate decent jobs, both rurally and in urban areas, generate decent incomes and increase resilience to shocks and lessen dependence on distant food sources. It aims to help foster greater urban-rural linkages, including connecting nutrient and waste flows across urban and rural areas, developing like a circular economy, and also promoting ecosystem and natural resource management, and it's essential is supporting participatory governance, both rurally and in urban areas. The city region food system has been, I suppose, loosely defined as the complex network of actors, processes and relationships to do with food production, processing, marketing and consumption that exists in a given geographical region, that include a more or less concentrated urban centre and its surrounding peri-urban and rural hinterland. So, but to really unpack the city region food system, it's essential to examine the terms city and region themselves. The city itself can refer to any urban area of any size, but it has to have a degree of concentration of population which predetermines the concentration of demand on services. A region itself is a more flexible space to define. It can be a political region or a sub-region or an ecosystem region or a geographical region. It could be a peri-urban region, a hinterland with smaller settlements, or as I look at in this paper, like a food shed, which is an area that's defined both culturally and ecologically. So for this paper, I focused on four main areas. So as I mentioned, the area, the concept of food sheds, food smart cities, placemaking, and transnational networks. The idea of food sheds, which is an idea, I suppose, analogous with watersheds, it begins from a premise that the land and what it can grow defines the parameters of a food system. So what can grow, I suppose, within the predetermined food shed defines what the food system can be, and it puts food at the centre of identifying what's possible, and moves away from the market considerations dominating debate surrounding food systems. It's not a new idea. It's been around since the 20s or even before the 20s, and building upon the work of Hedden in the 20s and Getz in the 90s, Kloppenberg defined food sheds as streams of foodstuffs running into a particular locality, their flow mediated by the features of both natural and social geography. Well, food sheds also consider the moral economy and the need to embed food into ecologies and human needs, alongside building communities and supporting social networks and creating place. So it sees food as cutting across silos and cutting across different systems, and it helps to, I suppose, view many different systems. Now, the other thing we looked at was, was placemaking. So placemaking is a multidisciplinary entry point to approach the challenges of the city region food system. So each place has its own unique set of assets to leverage and challenges to address as it evolves. And strategic placemaking can help develop collaboration between like fragmented groups, because cities have, it's essentially loads of different fragmented groups of people who kind of know each other or don't know each other. and it can help attach new meanings to places, rebrand places, and explore new uses or shared uses for places, which is essential to kind of re-envisage places within cities and how they can be used in different ways. And placemaking also capitalises on a local community's assets, inspiration and potential, with the intention of creating public spaces that promote people's health and happiness and well-being. It's political due to the nature of place identity. Placemaking is both a process and a philosophy that makes use of urban design principles, and it can be either official and government-led or community-driven, grassroots, tactical urbanism, such as I suppose what was promoted by Jane Jacobs in the 60s, and it underscores the particularities of places where food systems evolve, and it considers networks of key actors and markets, social capital and associated capacity for innovation, strength of supportive policy. So it sees communities at the centre of creating more livable spaces and helping develop cities themselves, both officially, through policy and community, and in a community-driven way. The other area I looked at was the idea of a smart city. So a smart city is essentially a technologically modern urban area that uses different types of electronic methods, voice activation methods and sensors to collect specific data, and information gained from that data is used to manage assets or resources and services efficiently, and in return that data is used to improve the operations of the city, theoretically. The smart city technology could allow city officials to interact directly with both community and city infrastructure, and to monitor what's happening in the city and how the city evolves. So it's also used to enhance quality performances and interactivity of urban services, and maybe to reduce costs and resource consumption, and to increase contact between citizens and government. But embedding tech into cities alone will not create smart cities, but it can enable and enhance policy and governance. So, for example, if a smart city strategy isn't planned, taking into account people with accessibility problems, people with disabilities affecting mobility or vision or hearing or cognitive function, the implementation of new technology could create new barriers. Now the idea of the 15-minute city, I kind of see it as an extension of both placemaking and the smart city, a marriage of both things. The 15-minute city, it's a residential urban concept whereby all city residents can meet most of their needs within a short walk, all their needs work or leisure, medical needs, etc. Within a short 15-minute walk or bike ride. And since the COVID-19 or the climate crisis at the forefront of people's minds, this has accelerated the consideration and implementation of the 15-minute city, with transnational city networks like the C40 cities and the developing frameworks for cities based around the idea of the 15-minute city, and the idea of building back better, with the 15-minute city idea at the heart of it. The C40 group, they developed a report, and this report highlighted the importance of inclusive community engagement through mechanisms like participatory budgeting, and it recommended adjusting city plans and infrastructure to encourage dense, complete communities, like a 15-minute city neighborhood framework. These transnational city networks, like C40 or Eurocities, ICLEI, and many others, they create city-to-city alliances, helping with knowledge and sharing best practice between like mayoral groups or city government groups, which have like power to, I suppose, enact change, to create some sort of transition towards more sustainable cities. And this is kind of based around the whole new urban agenda, which is adopted at Habitat 3 in 2016, which set a framework for achieving the SDG 11 sustainable cities. The Milan Urban Food Policy Pact was, as an extension of the new urban agenda, it commits city mayors to develop strategies to integrate food systems into policy making. Now, this is the first time that kind of sort of transnational city networks put food at the centre of their transnational city frameworks, in a way. So it was launched in 2015 with over 100 signatory cities from all over the world. It was led by the mayor of Milan at the time, who worked with a group of 46 cities to agree its content. The Food Policy Pact, the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, is the first international protocol through which city leaders committed to developing sustainable food systems to grant healthy and accessible food to all, protect biodiversity, fight against food waste. And today it's been signed by over 200 cities, and it's open to any city globally, so there's no barriers, or limited barriers to joining it. Like for instance, C40 cities is only accessible, or can only be joined by mega cities, or whatever is defined as a mega city, So I suppose in conclusion, the challenges faced by cities to meaningfully act on SDGs and engage with initiatives such as the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact and New Urban Agenda is considerable in the light of increasing pressures due to face urban areas between now and 2050 with increased population and migration and nutrition challenges, etc. But the city region food system perspective enables an integrated approach and contextual specificity, because it's not like no two cities are the same, no two city geographies or city food sheds are the same. So the city region food system framework takes this into account. And but the importance of communicating goals and data to all stakeholders, including citizens, in a relevant and an accessible manner is essential to develop end user engagement and participation. Food smart cities and I suppose the idea of an empowered smart citizen in this food smart cities as a paradigm for rural urban futures may offer a view of a future where citizens can communicate with the city through networked digital media, and at the same time the city can collect essential data from citizens through digital infrastructures. However, the question exists whether the motivation of the smart city agenda is currently making the best use of the current digital infrastructures, or is it continuing on a neoliberal agenda, because most of the infrastructure that's of the smart cities is owned by private companies like IBM and the like, So. Now, the open source urbanism is a concept advocated by many, but including the sociologist Saskia Sassen. She sees cities deploying open source thinking at a cultural and technological level, and the design of systems based around communities and dialogue rather than top-down communications. And I suppose opening the black box of data to be accessed by citizens and communities, and having citizens' participation in this smart city is essential to transitioning to a sustainable and more livable cities, I guess. That's the conclusion of my presentation. I'd like to thank Charles Spillane, Peter McKeown for their help over the last few months in this project, and over the last year, of course, in this MScCCAFS. It's been a great year. It's been an interesting year, and let's wish everyone good luck in the future and in whatever they decide to do. I'm sure you're gonna change the world, hopefully. So thanks and good luck.
Hello everyone, I am Martha Muluda and I'm from Malawi, and my NUI Galway research was on modeling the impacts of integrating soybean in maize cropping systems in the agroecological regions of Zambia. And this research was done in collaboration with the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, IITA. As a matter of background of food production under global climate change, the current consumer habits and the population increase are worsening the negative consequences of climate change on agriculture. The Sub-Saharan Africa region is one of the most vulnerable regions because of its highest proportion of malnourished people. In this region, Eastern and Southern Africa are more vulnerable due to their overdependence on staples such as maize, which is one of the crops being negatively affected by the climate change. The IPCC Fourth Assessment Report shows that Africa's mean annual warming is likely to be greater than the global mean, and this would negatively affect maize yields. And in addition to climate risks, farmers in Sub-Saharan Africa are facing the challenges that are caused by soil degradation. Monocropping and reliance on heavy inorganic fertilizers are amongst the leading causes of soil degradation. Sustainable intensification technologies can potentially enhance input efficiency and lead to reduction of environmental impact, as argued by Preeti and Balucha. Legume integration in the maize cropping systems through rotation is an example of such sustainable intensification technologies. The practice of legume integration increases the soil biomass and restores soil fertility by increasing the soil organic content. Despite the promotion of some of the environmentally friendly technologies, adoption levels of most practices remain low in this region as well as in Zambia. Some technologies disregard localized and subnational variables that are significant in devising location-specific adaptation methods, since they have a regional or national focus. Depending on local biophysical and socio-economic conditions, the relative applicability and contribution of these practices in cropping systems vary. Therefore, my research objective was to model the impacts of integrating soybean in maize cropping systems in the agroecological regions of Zambia. Specifically, my study was simulating the site-specific options of rotating soybean in maize cropping systems and guiding with climate-resilient practices in the agroecologies of Zambia. This slide is highlighting the methodology that I used to do my research. The Decision Support System for Agrotechnology Transfer DSAT of version 4.7.5 software was used to sequentially simulate the soybean maize rotations. During the simulations, crop growth model was used to simulate the soybean, whereas Ceres maize model was used to simulate maize. Two soybean varieties, each of the three maturity periods, namely early, medium, and late, preceded maize crop in the simulations. The simulations were performed on 4 representative soils of the regions of Zambia. Predominant soils of each region were selected through the soil module of the DSAT. The boundaries were identified using the Google Earth Pro. The harmonized World Soil Database view allocated the regions and identified the available soil. 4 weather stations were created in the desert weatherman package using the secondary data from NASA. Data was analyzed using the analysis of variance ANOVA on JAMOV software. This slide is giving the simulated maize yields from the 4 representative soils of the 4 agroecological regions of Zambia. These soils are ferric ruvi from region 1, xanthic ferrous soils from region 2A, karstic solonies from region 2B, and rhodic ferrous soil from region 3. There were consistent higher maize yields under early and medium soybean variety rotations on ferric ruvi soils. 6.3% lower yields were observed on the same ferric ruvi soils under longer maturing varieties. Rhodic ferrous soils and karstic solonies performed well under longer maturing varieties compared to the early and medium maturing varieties simulations. Lowest mean yields of 3.6 tons, that represents 17.2% lower than the overall mean, were observed on xanthic ferrous soils. Overall, ferric ruvi soils under region 1 demonstrated that it can contribute to higher maize yields under rotations with early and medium maturing varieties. This is despite the fact that the area received relatively low rainfall amounts and the area also had the higher mean maximum temperatures during the simulation years. This increase can be attributed to the fact that ruvi soils have a layer of humus on top of their severely enriched layer that is practically devoid of clay and iron-bearing minerals. A layer of mixed clay accumulation that exists beneath this soil horizon contains high amounts of accessible nutritional ions such as calcium, magnesium, sodium, and others. In addition, clay has a greater capacity to retain soil organic carbon because it has a larger specific surface area that carries a charge, and this allows it to bind and chemically stabilize the organic chemicals. Next is the comparison of the mean yields of the soil types using the Tukey test that is in the ANOVA. Under this, each soil type is compared to the other 3 soils to check their significance at P0.05 confidence interval. From this table, we can see that the mean difference was higher on comparison of xanthic soils to all the other 3 soil types from the 3 regions. Therefore, significant differences were also found on the same xanthic ferrous soils in region 2A. This soil gave significantly lowest yields compared to the rest of the soils. Therefore, it can be concluded that the impact of soybean on subsequent maize yields vary depending on soil fertility status, weather conditions, and the management capacity of the farmers. There is a positive interaction between the soil type and the soybean maturity period in influencing maize yields in the rotation. Shorter and medium maturing varieties of soybean should be used in potentially fertile soils such as the ferric ruvi soils to maximize the available nutrients in the possibly shortest period while escaping the likely drought periods. The late maturing soybean varieties have shown to contribute to higher maize yields in regions which receive the higher rains. Ferric ruvi soils are characterized by clays that hold organic matter and lead to more carbon sequestration, thereby supporting maize growth and giving higher maize yields. And maize use can be potentially improved in all regions if farmers employ farming practices that enhance the soil's capacity to retain organic matter. These practices are key to adaptation to climate change impacts and attainment of various sustainable development goals that include the reduction of poverty and hunger. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the NUI Galway supervisors that are Professor Charles Spiden, Dr. Peter McKeown, and Dr. Galina Plitkova for the inspiration and technical support that has made my project and overall study feasible. I'm also grateful to the hosting institution supervisors, that is from IITA, and specifically Dr. Sika and Dr. David Chikoe for providing the relevant data that I used during this research and for guiding me on using the DSAT. And special thanks should go to Kalua Banda, the previous MScCCAFS student, for offering the DSAT training. And I'm also grateful to the funders of my study, that is the Irish government, for fully sponsoring my studies in Ireland. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Murray and my project is a review of indicator frameworks for determining those furthest behind in their capacity to adapt to and mitigate climate change impacts in agriculture. So determining the furthest behind in terms of adaptive capacity is a key aim of my project. So this follows the Leave No One Behind agenda, which is a guiding principle of the Sustainable Development Goals. So 3 elements of the Leave No One Behind agenda include progressive universalism, so putting the furthest behind first, anti-discrimination measures, and the recognition of intersectionality. So how can we determine the furthest behind? Well, this depends on a variety of other socioeconomic factors which can vary spatially. So for example, in Vietnam, socioeconomic factors contributing to an individual being furthest behind include gender, ethnicity, health, and location. However, these also intersect with one another. So for example, ethnic minority groups are found to be among the poorest in Vietnam, with a large percentage of ethnic minority groups living in the Northern Mountain or Central Highlands, with poor quality land and where they're less likely to speak Vietnamese and therefore facing language barriers. And they're more likely to face discrimination in terms of access to services in these areas too. So one way to determine who is in need of interventions to improve their resilience to climate change is through measuring climate vulnerability. So according to the IPCC, vulnerability is measured as a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So one method of measuring climate vulnerability is using climate vulnerability mapping, which can be used to direct attention to areas which are vulnerable to climate change impacts and where interventions for adaptation may be necessary. So in the map here you can see areas in red have high exposure and sensitivity but low adaptive capacity. So these are areas that are considered to be most vulnerable to climate change. So for my project, I performed a literature review. So I assessed indicators from climate vulnerability studies and Leave No One Behind literature. I looked into composite indexes and I compared expert and statistic-based modelling of data. I also assessed expert-based frameworks. So I used the Yen Bai province in Vietnam as a case study. So this province is in the northern mountain region where poverty rates remain high and where there are a wide variety of intersecting socioeconomic characteristics. So in particular, I looked into the measurement of adaptive capacity. So I found that in climate vulnerability studies, there is a large amount of variability when it comes to measuring adaptive capacity. So for example, in some papers, they use indicators based on food security and others disaster response capacity. So I wanted to determine whether a single framework could be used to measure the furthest behind in terms of adaptive capacity. Now, there are some site-specific considerations that are essential to certain studies, such as group-based inequalities or data limitations. However, a framework which could take these considerations into account would improve the effectiveness of these studies. So the use of frameworks to determine the furthest behind in terms of adaptive capacity can improve the comparability of studies and therefore their effectiveness. So the measurement of adaptive capacity can determine those who are most and least capable of adopting climate change adaptation practices and technologies. And two frameworks which I reviewed that could be used to measure adaptive capacity include the Leave No One Behind framework and the IPCC determinants of adaptive capacity. So there are many overlaps and similarities between these two frameworks, and one of the main benefits of these frameworks is their use of broad categories rather than specific indicators. So what this could mean is that indicators could be tailored and altered for site-specific considerations. And the categories in these frameworks have been used in previous climate vulnerability studies. So certain categories have been used more than others. So for example, access and quality of services, intersecting inequalities in education and inequalities in nutrition and healthcare has been used in multiple studies. Whereas public perception of source and significance of exposure, that hasn't previously been used in any climate vulnerability studies that I reviewed. And the use of these categories in climate vulnerability studies shows that they can be applied at multiple locations, which shows that these frameworks could be used to improve the comparability of climate vulnerability studies. So one of the main benefits of understanding adaptive capacity is the ability to use this information to target specific adaptation strategies, such as climate smart agriculture. However, it's important to connect the socioeconomic factors which determine adaptive capacity with the barriers to the uptake of climate adaptation strategies. So these directly relate to one another, and understanding this connection can enable these barriers to be overcome. So some barriers in literature which prevent the uptake of climate adaptation strategies include financial and market barriers, knowledge and informational barriers, institutional barriers, psychological and cultural barriers, or technical and implementation barriers. So before it's possible to put these frameworks into use, there are some issues which need to be overcome. So this includes data collection and availability. So this will require investments, but it needs to be at a usable scale, such as at the household or commune level, and it needs to cover a wider range of socioeconomic factors. So understanding which indicators to use within these frameworks is also important to ensure that these can be used at multiple locations and multiple scales. Another issue to overcome is how best to use this information to target specific tailored adaptation strategies to vulnerable groups. So that would include understanding how socioeconomic factors act as barriers to adoption of climate adaptation strategies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Una Murray. I'm a lecturer at NUI Galway in the geography discipline. I coordinate and teach a module on gender, agriculture and climate justice for this Masters in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security. And that module focuses on the impact of climate change on different groups. So we analyse how climate change does not affect all in the same way, and it's important for us to understand the social impacts of climate change, as much depends on resources, livelihood options, ability to adapt or mitigate, information, capital, knowledge, and of course the ability to take decisions. So we look at climate change from a social impact perspective, and this is also of key importance to many of our partners. Hence, I was delighted to see so many dissertations this year focusing on concepts such as gender equality and empowerment and social impacts. And others included social issues as they relate to the effects of climate change, in, for example, different technologies. I also appreciated the strong policy focus in many research outputs, where you developed ideas on how governments and others can incorporate social and especially gender perspectives when they address climate change. So well done to all of you. You've performed exceptionally well given the difficult circumstances brought about by COVID, and also the lack of face-to-face meetings. So congratulations to all of you. Thanks.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on your time zone. First of all, let me thank you all for tuning in and showing interest in my presentation. My name is Noel Nglovo and I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm currently completing a Master of Science degree in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security at NUI Galway. Today I'm going to share with you the findings of my research titled Unraveling the Genetic Architecture of Grain Quality Traits under Optimum and Low Nitrogen Stress Conditions using Tropical Maize Germplasm. Just a brief background of the crop. Maize is the most important cereal crop in sub-Saharan Africa, with average per capita consumption being more than 100 kgs per person per year. In some parts of the world, the crop serves as an animal feed and a biorefinery feedstock. This research was carried out in collaboration with CIMMYT head office in Mexico and the Spillen Genetics Lab at the Plant and Agrobiosciences Research Center. The study was done under the direct supervision of Professor Spillen and Dr. McKeown from NUI Galway, and Dr. Gouda, Dr. Keynes, and Dr. Das from CIMMYT. The presentation is divided into 4 main parts, which is the background, methodology, results, and the conclusion section. Maize production is hampered by a variety of stresses, including drought, weeds, insect pests, as well as degraded and nutrient-starved soils. In particular, soils in sub-Saharan Africa are nitrogen deficient due to low fertilizer use and inadequate soil fertility management practices. On average, small-scale farmers in this region apply only 9 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare of cropland. This has resulted in a significant yield gap for the major staple maize crop, which is undermining nutritional security, livelihood sustainability across the region. Maize yields in smallholder farming communities of sub-Saharan Africa are just but a fraction of those in the developing world. Studies have shown that regional averages range from 1 to 3 metric tons per hectare, which is lower than the global average of 5 metric tons per hectare. In this respect, the demand for maize in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to triple by the year 2050 as a result of rapid population growth, while adverse effects of climate change on maize production and quality traits are likely to increase. On another end, malnutrition levels in sub-Saharan Africa continue to rise at worrisome rates, with 239 million people reported to be undernourished in 2018 alone. Despite the high socio-economic value of maize, its grain has a low oil and protein contents, but a relatively higher starch content based on dry matter measurements. This limits its role in alleviating hidden hunger in sub-Saharan Africa. Furthermore, the current elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have been shown to have a negative effect in the levels of micronutrients in edible tissues of mostly C3 and some C4 plants such as maize. Due to the impoverished economic situation of smallholder farmers, nitrogen fertilization is not currently an accessible solution to combat endemic undernutrition. Breeding for nutrient-efficient maize genotypes with high grain yield and quality traits, that is, protein, starch, and oil content, is one approach for ensuring food and nutrition security in soil and starved environments. However, efficient breeding for enhanced maize nutrient content is hinged on our understanding of the genetic architecture of grain quality. In order to understand how low nitrogen stress affects key grain quality traits, this genomic study was carried out in a tropical maize population under low nitrogen and optimum conditions in Kenya and South Africa. The research employed genomic-wide association study, also known as GWAS, lineage mapping, and genomic selection for identifying causal variants for improved protein, starch, and oil content, as well as yield under low soil nitrogen conditions. The study was guided by the following objectives. Number 1, to assess the genetic architecture of low soil nitrogen tolerant maize test crosses using their responses to grain protein, starch, oil, and yield traits under optimum and low soil nitrogen. Number 2, identify the significant quantitative trait nucleotides and putative candidate genes for quality traits in tropical maize germplasm tested in multiple locations. Number 3, assess the potential of utilizing genomic selection in the improvement of grain quality traits. Next, I would like to give you an overview of the research methodology. I divided this section into 3 main stages and constructed a graphic to better visualize the experimental procedures. Stage 1 focused on phenotypic and nutrient characterization. At this stage, field experiments focusing on grain protein, starch, and oil content as well as yield were conducted in 2 sites in Kenya and 1 site in South Africa, under an alpha lattice design with 2 replications. 410 IMUS panel and 4 double the haploid populations were evaluated in this study, and a near infrared spectroscopy, force infratech, was used for nutritional assaying. The data analysis at this stage was done using Meta-R and R version 4.04. Stage 2 placed detailed emphasis on discovering the novel loci associated to grain quality traits in maize. In this quest, genotyping by sequencing was done using the CTAB method. The farm CPU model was used for GWAS. The first 3 principal components derived by tarsal were used as inputs for the GWAS analysis, and the GWAS output was presented using Manhattan and quantile plots, which were produced using the GAPIT function of the farm CPU model. Stage 3 described 3 subgroups of bioinformatic functional analysis. The first procedure was aimed at identifying the candidate genes. This was done by checking the putative genes on the maize GDP and maize ensemble websites using the BLAST2 against the representative genome B73 version 3 set. The second procedure focused on quantitative trait loci QTL detection. For this, linkage maps were constructed using the QTL ICI mapping version 4.1 software. The last subgroup aimed at determining the genomic prediction accuracies, and the ridge regression BLAP RR BLAP with 5-fold cross validation for each trait was used for this analysis. I'll now go on to highlight the main results of this study. A broad range of variation was demonstrated by grain quality traits under optimum and low N stress environments across the studied genotypes. Generally, the phenotypic analysis showed that protein and oil content were significantly decreased under low nitrogen stress compared to optimum conditions across all tested genotypes. In contrary, a positive percentage change in starch content was observed in all populations across the 2 nitrogen management options. The IMUS panel had the highest protein content, while DH population 2 had the highest oil content under low nitrogen. Such genotypes should be considered for incorporation into maize breeding programs targeting sub-Saharan Africa region. In breeding for high-stress environments, genetic variability is considered crucial for the effective selection of enhanced grain quality traits in maize. The study found that genotypic, environmental, and G by E variations among the studied grain quality traits were significant only on maize oil content under low nitrogen stress. The detected significant genotypic variation for the assessed traits in this study indicated the possibility of selecting for improved protein, starch, and oil content under low nitrogen stress. Moving forward, our study estimated moderate to high broad sense irritabilities for the studied traits. The observed lack of relationship between starch and the quality traits in this research under both optimum and low nitrogen conditions imply that selecting for starch alone will not increase protein or oil content. The use of GWAS in maize genetics has been highly effective in discovering causal genes for grain quality traits. In this study, GWAS identified 42 single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, linked to the grain quality traits studied under low nitrogen conditions. However, there were no overlapping SNPs for both grain quality traits under low nitrogen stress. The genetic Regions identified in this work through GWAS will be increasingly relevant in future breeding approaches for accurate selection of high grain quality and to increase tolerance of maize lines to low nitrogen stress. These SNPs were associated with 51 putative candidate genes, with 10 SNPs linked to 3 known maize genes. The putative candidate genes were associated with the histone, lysine, N-methyltransferase, ATP binding proteins, DNA biosynthesis, shoot apex development, among others. Shoot apex development is known to be a good indicator of nitrogen sufficiency in maize. The research also discovered 4 putative genes with protein serine or threonine kinase activity that play a role in soil nitrogen response and plants' tolerance to abiotic stresses. It is important to note, however, that these putative candidate genes should be validated before being used in future breeding schemes. On another note, linkage mapping across populations found multiple quantitative trait loci for the studied grain quality traits. The promise of genomic selection in tropical maize for various traits of interest has been evaluated in several studies. In this study, the genomic prediction accuracy varied across the studied genotypes and grain quality traits. Genomic prediction accuracies have an implication on the degree of trait genotypic diversity and heritability. This study indicates that utilizing a common training population to predict grain quality traits under low nitrogen stress in many linked but separate populations can be beneficial. I would just like to finish by highlighting the key conclusions drawn from this study. The study showed that genotypic correlations of the grain quality traits for these populations can be used to select better performing genotypes under low nitrogen stress. Our findings also indicate that grain quality traits are polygenic and that using genomic prediction in maize breeding for nutrition can improve genetic gain for protein, starch, and oil content. The genomic regions identified can be used for selection efforts to enhance grain quality trait performance in low nitrogen soils of sub-Saharan Africa. Furthermore, the findings showed that including genomic selection into maize breeding can successfully support phenotypic selection to improve grain quality trait performance under low nitrogen stress. Future work should therefore focus on validating the identified putative candidate genes and QTLs to enhance the efficacy of future maize breeding schemes. I am grateful to the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMIT, and partner scientists and technicians who generated the germplasm, designed and conducted the experiments used in exploring my objectives. Gratitude is also extended to the Cornell University Genotyping Facility and Prof. Ed Butler as a group for providing genotyping services. I would also like to acknowledge my research supervisors, Professor Charles Spillen and Dr. Peter C. McKeon from NUI Galway, Dr. Manja Gouda, Dr. Jill Keynes, and Dr. Bisnawath Das from CIMIT. Big thanks to Dr. Kevin Vale Pixley for his edits and reviews. And this study was made possible by a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to CIMIT and a fellowship award from IRISH to me. Kindly find the included list of the references consulted in developing this presentation. Thank you.
Daniel Nagasi. My MScCCAFS research project topic was continuum of rainfall and irrigation. This project was done in collaboration with NYG and host partner organization, International Water Management Institute. I would like to express my gratitude to NYG supervisors, Professor Charles Spillen, Dr. Peter McKeown, and host partner organization supervisor, Dr. Amar Haile Selassie, and Irish Aid for funding me for completion of my studies. Hello, my name is Daniel Nagasi. My MScCCAFS research project topic was continuum of rainfall in the irrigation. This project was done in collaboration with NYG and host partner organization, the National Water Management Institute. Rainfall in the irrigation are interdependent units across landscape and watershed levels, even though their names are different. Most policies kept rainfall and irrigation separately. The poor management of water in a rainfall system causes erosion, runoff, and low yields, and the poor management of blue water makes the irrigation system less resilient to drought. Therefore, the upgrading of a rainfed system introduces the new area of rainfed irrigation continuum. The rainfed irrigation continuum increases water productivity and farmer livelihoods. This means that by keeping rainfed and irrigation policies together, increases the water productivity and farmers' livelihoods, rather than keeping rainfed and irrigation policies separately. Frameworks of rainfed irrigation continuum. Generally, water classified into two, green and blue water. Green water is the major source of a rainfed system or rainfed agriculture, and the blue water it's the runoff which is collected in the water harvesting structures, which is the primary source of for the irrigation system. The rainfall irrigation continuum required an investment across the landscape. This can be green water management in the upstream and blue water productivity in the downstream. As the picture shows, the rainfall irrigation continuum starts with the conservation practices in the upstream. There is also a supplemental irrigation which acts as a bridge during the dry spells, helps to reduce the risk of rainfall system. There is also water harvesting. Water harvesting can be in situ or ex situ. In situ means that by utilizing the soil to store infiltrated rainfall, and ex situ it's a man-made storages to store rainfall, to store the infiltrated rainfall. It can needs to be used for the irrigation agriculture. There is also groundwater irrigation, surface water irrigation, which uses the water from the water which is collected, which is the blue water collected from the water harvesting structures. In general, the rainfall irrigation continuum, it's the virtual transfer of water from between rainfall and irrigation, and vice versa. The research was mainly based on the literature review, the primary and secondary source, as well as the report from the International Water Management Institute and working papers from the International Water Management Institute. Here are some of the research findings. The upstream watershed activities impacts the water quantity and water quality in the downstream, which means that the good watershed activities in the upstream increases the water quantity and water quality in the downstream, and the poor or improper watershed activities in the upstream reduces or decreases the water quantity and water quality in the downstream. The water management investment across the landscape enhances the water availability in the downstream and erosion, because erosion is one of the major problems. Initiative payment schemes improve the socio-economic of upstream and downstream communities by conserving the environment, such as the PES and payment for ecosystem and green water credits. This payment system helps to enhance integration of the upstream and downstream communities. This can be done by the downstream communities aid to the upstream communities for the soil and water conservation activities implemented in the upstream. Erosion in sedimentation affects the storage level of the reservoirs, and the sustainable sedimentation management strategies reduces the sediments in the reservoirs and increase the water holding capacity of the reservoirs. Here are my conclusion remarks. The policy shift focusing on water management investment across the continuum is required, from the purely rainfed agriculture to full irrigation agriculture. And secondly, a comprehensive sustainable sedimentation management strategy is required to effectively reduce the sedimentation levels in the downstream reservoirs. In conclusion of my presentation, I would like to thank my NYG supervisors and host institution supervisors for the continuation support during my research, and I would like also to thank Irish Air for funding me to complete the course. Thank you.
Hello everyone. My name is Lukonga Ngalamanda. I'm finalizing my MScCCAFS studies from NUI Galway. My presentation focuses on my research project, which looked at climate smart agriculture, practices, awareness, adoption and disadoption by smallholder village savings loan association farmer groups in Malawi. The host partner organization for this project is CGIAR Association for Malawi. In introducing my research organization for this, I would like to make mention that currently climate change has negatively affected crop yields of the sub-Saharan Africa, thereby contributing to the threats of food security of the region. CSA has been validated by research to be a coping strategy for the farmers against the effects of climate change. This has led to its promotion at scale. Malawi is one country that has benefited from CSA promotion by CSA supporters. The challenge, however, is knowledge integration across multiple levels. Here we see efforts to showcase CSA positive results and adoption through a field day held in Dowa district. The farmer is showcasing to fellow farmers his field where he's using external mulch to conserve moisture. Scale adoption by smallholders in Malawi has remained below expectation and disadoption experienced in some cases. This study adds to the existing knowledge from other research which focused on CSA adoption, disadoption, and barriers to adoption. This study explores CSA awareness, adoption, and disadoption among VSLA farmers in Malawi. The exploration into the topic was done by first compiling 59 CSA practices derived from CSA Compendium developed by CCAFS, CSA practices promoted by the Malawi Alliance, and practices promoted by the Care Pathways program in Malawi. Sample size of 91 VSLA group was selected out of the 222 groups. Thereafter, a focus group interview was conducted using a questionnaire approach. The data collected was analyzed using Microsoft Excel to give the levels of awareness, the extent of the use of CSA practices by the VSLA groups, and the levels of adoption and disadoption. Results indicate that there were high levels of awareness in numerous CSA groups, except for practices such as the use of broker, green manure, and precision agriculture. The graph shows that farmers were highly aware of practices relating to soil fertility, except for the use of external material for mulching and salt-tolerance cultivars. The use of salt-tolerance cultivars seemed to be uncommon among VSL farmers, maybe because salt is not a common problem in Malawi. Generally, there were awareness of practices relating to crop production, but also there's a record of completely unawareness where 0% of the farmers were unaware of the practice. From the graph, we can see the orange and the blue. And the orange shows 100% awareness within the groups, while the blue shows 0% awareness within the group. For the levels of usage, results show that there were low levels of use of most CSA practices. The graph shows that for practices such as the use of inorganic fertilizers, ridges in field, timely planting, intercropping with legumes, and basic irrigation, including watering cans, over 60% of the VSL groups had all the people, that is 100%, practicing the technology. We see orange coloration, which indicates 100% practice, and the blue coloration, which indicates 0% practice. From the coloration, we can see that the blue is predominant, meaning there is very low levels of usage for the CSA practices. And this brings us now to the levels of adoption and disadoption, where results show higher adoption compared to disadoption. We, however, have notable disadoption in conservation agriculture, application of fertilizer and lime, precision agriculture, liming, drip irrigation, improved cookstoves, and crop insurance. The blue correlation is the level of adoption, and the orange is the level of disadoption. So we see a proportion of farmers who are adopters indicated in blue, while orange, who are the disadopters indicated in orange. Further, the research looked at the main service providers of the CSA practices, which were available to the farmers. Results show that a holistic CSA dissemination system exists in Malawi. CSA practices are provided by a mixture of government, NGOs, companies, and community members. To end my presentation, in conclusion, CSA practices. In introducing my research project, I'd like to make mention that currently climate change has negatively affected crop yields of the sub-Saharan Africa and thereby contributing to the threats of food security of the region. CSA has been validated by research to be a coping strategy for the farmers against the effects of climate change. This has led to its promotion at scale. Malawi is one country that has benefited from the CSA promotion by CSA promoters. The challenge, however, remains the knowledge integration across multiple levels. Here we see an effort to showcase CSA positive results and adoption through a field day held in Dowa, Malawi. This farmer is showing to other farmers his field of external mulch. He's using external mulch on his field to conserve moisture. Scale adoption by smallholders in Malawi has remained below expectation, and disadoption has been experienced in some cases. This study therefore adds to the existing knowledge from other research which focused on CSA adoption, disadoption, and barriers to adoption. The research explores CSA awareness, adoption, and disadoption among VSLA farmers in Malawi. The exploration into the topic was done by first compiling 59 CSA practices derived from a CSA compendium developed by CCAFS, CSA practices promoted by Malawi Alliance, and CSA practices promoted by the Care Pathway Program in Malawi. A sample size of 91 VSLAs was used from a population of 2,222 VSLAs. Thereafter, a focus group interview was conducted using a questionnaire approach. The data collected was analyzed using Microsoft Excel to give the levels of awareness, the extent of use of CSA practices by the VSLA groups, and levels of adoption and disadoption. Results indicate that there were high levels of awareness of numerous CSA practices, with exception of the use of broker, green manure, and precision agriculture. The graphs also show that farmers were highly aware of practices relating to soil fertility, except for external material for mulching and salt-tolerant cultivars. The use of salt-tolerant cultivars seems to be uncommon in Malawi, maybe because salt is not a common problem. Generally, there are high levels of awareness of CSA practices relating to crop production. Of course, we can also see a record of many VSL groups being completely unaware of the practices. Now, let me just explain on the graphs. We have the predominant orange coloration and the blue coloration. The orange coloration represents the level of awareness where in each group 100%, meaning all the members of the group are aware of the practice. And the coloration in blue indicates 0% awareness. So from the graph, we can generally see a lot of orange showing that there is actually high awareness in most of the CSA practices. Looking at the levels of usage of the CSA practices, there is a contrast. In contrast to the relative high level of awareness, there is low level of usage of most of the CSA practices. Over 60% of the sampled groups showed that 100% people were using practices such as inorganic fertilizers, that is the common NPK fertilizers, and then manure, ridges in fields, timely planting, intercropping, and basic legume. The intercropping is where farmers intercrop legumes in their fields. And then we also see 0% use of most of the CSA practices. The 0% use is in blue, and in orange is the 100% use. So from the coloration again, we can see a dominance in blue, which is 0% use of the CSA practice. So from here we can conclude that most of the CA practices were uncommon in terms of usage among the farmers. And then coming to the levels of adoption and disadoption, we discover that there is a record of disadoption among the farmers. The orange coloration is indicating disadoption levels, and these disadoption levels are so much notable for climate smart, for conservation agriculture. They are also notable for fertilizer plus liming. They are also notable for precision agriculture, drip irrigation, improved cookstoves, crop insurance. And then we have the blue coloration, which is an indication of a proportion of farmers who are currently using the practice adopters. So from the graph, we can tell that there are more adopters compared to disadopters of CSA technology. The study further went into looking at the promoters of CSA in Malawi. And from the study, it is showing that CSA practices which are accessible to the VSL farmers are provided by a mixture of organizations which include the government of Malawi, NGOs, companies, and community members. There are also a number of CSA practices that are not supported by any promoters, among which is the use of precision agriculture, which happens to be among the disadopted practices. And then we also have fertilizer and lime and crop insurance, which is predominantly supported by companies, while government institutions are the main actors in the support towards organic fertilizer inputs, subsurface fertilization, and manure. Hello everyone, my name is. In conclusion, CSA practice stands to be finalizing my MScCCAFS studies from and should be NUI Galway. My presentation focuses on my research scaling CSA presents cost and climate smart agriculture practices awareness, adoption, design and scaling by smallholder farmers. CSA scaling programs should be designed to integrate knowledge at all organization to increase awareness. Project is CSA promoters tailor CSA advice to in introducing my research to achieve the goal of scaling tailored practices according to the farmers' recommendation has negatively affected crop yields of the productive the sub-Saharan CSA dissemination system, thereby contributing to the threats of food security of the region opportunity and should be coordinated to avoid duplication to be a coping strategy for the farmers against the effects of climate change. This has led to its promotion at scale. Malawi is one country in sub-Saharan Africa that has benefited from CSA promotion by CSA supporters. The challenge, however, is knowledge integration across multiple levels. Here we see efforts to showcase CSA positive results and adoption through a field day held in Dowa district. We see the farmer there trying to showcase the practice of external mulch in his field in order to conserve moisture. Scale adoption by smallholders in Malawi has remained below expectation and disadoption is experienced in some cases. This study therefore adds to the existing knowledge from other research which have focused on CSA adoption, disadoption, and barriers to adoption. This research explores CSA awareness, adoption, and disadoption among VSLA farmers in Malawi. The exploration into the topic was done by first compiling 59 CSA practices derived from CSA Compendium developed by CCAFS, CSA practices promoted by Malawi Alliance, and practices promoted by the Care Pathway Program in Malawi. A sample size of 91 Village Saving Loan Association groups was selected out of the 222 groups. Thereafter, a focus group interview was conducted using a questionnaire approach. The data collected was analyzed using Microsoft Excel to give the levels of awareness, extent of use of CSA practices by the VSLA groups, and the levels of adoption and disadoption. Results indicate that there were high levels of awareness of numerous CSA practices, except for practices such as the use of brochure, green manure, and precision agriculture. The graph shows that farmers were highly aware of practices relating to soil fertility, except for the use of external material for mulching and the use of salt-tolerant cultivars. The use of salt-tolerant cultivars seem uncommon among farmers in the VSL groups, maybe because salt is not a common problem in Malawi. And generally, they were also aware of practices relating to crop production, although we can see some record of many VSL farmers being completely unaware of the technology. Those farmers that were completely unaware are indicated in blue, and where 100% of the farmers were aware are indicated in orange. And we see that orange color there dominates to indicate that there's generally high levels of awareness in most of the CSA practices. For the levels of usage, results show that there were low levels of use of most CSA practices. 100% use recorded in over 60% of the sample is seen on practices such as the use of organic fertilizer, manure, ridges in fields, timely planting, intercropping with legumes, and basic irrigation. The graph shows that practices such as the use of inorganic fertilizer, ridges in field, timely planting, intercropping with legumes, and basic irrigation, including watering can, are common in most CSA groups. Though we have 0% lack of use, which is indicated in blue. Most of the farmers are completely not using some of the technologies, which include water management, post-harvest, food and energy systems, and insurance. Specifically, we are looking at lack of use of practices such as drip and deficit irrigation, improved preservation, cook stoves, insurance, improved drying, improved physical storage. And this brings us now to the levels of adoption and disadoption, where results show higher adoption compared to disadoption. There is, however, notable disadoption in conservation agriculture, application of fertilizer, and lime, precision agriculture, liming, drip irrigation, improved cook stoves, and crop insurance. The blue is level of adoption and orange level of disadoption. From the graph, we can see that some adoption levels are more than 40%, are up to 40% of this adoption. Further, the research looked at the main service providers of the CSA practices which were available to the farmers. Results show that a pluralistic CSA dissemination system exists in Malawi. CSA practices are provided by a mixture of government, NGOs, companies, and community members. There are, however, other CSA practices that are not provided by any of the CSA supporters. In conclusion, CSA practice remain a strategy to adapt to climate change, and it should be scaled among smallholder farmers in Malawi. Scaling CSA practices presents costs and benefits, which should be estimated by promoters when designing scaling programs. CSA scaling programs should be designed to integrate knowledge at all levels to increase awareness among smallholder farmers. CSA promoters should tailor CSA advice to farm characteristics in order to achieve the goal of scaling tailored practices according to farmers' recommendation and suited to context. The pluralistic CSA dissemination system that exists presents CSA scaling opportunity and should be coordinated to avoid duplication of effort. To end my presentation, I would like to thank the team of NUIG supervisors who provided guidance through the research project. I would be failing in my duties if I don't recognize the contribution of the host partner organization towards the completion of this project, and the Irish Aid for providing financial support through the award of the Irish Aid Fellowship to allow me conduct the research. And this marks the end of my presentation. Thank you. To end my presentation, I'd like to thank the team of NUI supervisors for seeing me through the end of this program and for helping me complete my thesis. Many thanks also go to the partner organization, CARE International, and the Irish Aid for the financial support through the award of the Irish Aid Fellowship. Thank you very much.
Dear CCAFS students, as new graduates who will start to look for the job, you may think that you have a dilemma in front of you. You need experience to get a job, but a job to get an experience. So what can you do? Actually, the transferable skills that you gain during your MScCCAFS program are crucial to show your experience and attributes. Your transferable skills will help you to stand out from the crowd when applying for a job. Therefore, it is very important to understand and highlight your transferable skills that you gained during your one-year master degree training in NUI Galway. And do not forget to explain in your CV and give some details of when and how you used your transferable skills during your research project. Good luck with the job application and your future scientific career.
Hello, my name is Dow Ryan, and I am presenting on my project, Agroecology and Climate Change Policy, Leverage Points for Transformative Action. This is part of my requirements for the Masters in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security at the National University of Ireland, Galway, in partnership with CIAT Bioversity. I started my project by looking at how agroecology, which offers a wide-ranging suite of principles and practices that can both respond to, adapt, and mitigate the effects of climate change in communities around the world, through a suite of agronomic practices as well as social and economic and educational ways of orienting production systems to benefit local communities. So knowing that all of these beneficial outcomes are possible through the introduction of agroecology, I thought it would be important to look at how policies supporting these types of practices are present in various countries around the world. I also wanted to think about how and if these policies are being translated into international climate commitments, such as the Paris Agreement. So I decided to look at whether the nationally determined contributions, which are the ways in which countries that are signatories to the Paris Agreement are quantifying and defining their climate commitments, whether those contain or reference agroecology. In order to do this, I looked at the UNFCCC NDC registry, which lists all of the nationally determined contributions from all 192 signatories of the Paris Agreement. I also looked at the FAO Agroecology Lex database for countries that have agroecology policies in place. And by assessing the commonalities and differences between the various countries that have agroecology policies in place at the national and subnational level, and then taking a look at the nationally determined contributions of those countries, I was able to see how agroecology policies are translating between the national and subnational level and the international level. So first here we see the 44 countries that have agroecology policies in place at either the national or subnational level. Here we see a representation of countries that include agroecology in their NDCs. On the left are 11 countries that include agroecology in their current updated NDC submissions. On the right, we see 4 countries that included agroecology in their first NDC submissions, but in later updated submissions omitted references to agroecology. This may be due to potentially political associations of agroecology and its focus on equality in land distribution and social and economic reforms that benefit small farmers, that in some cases go against business as usual agricultural policies. Overall, there are 4 countries that have agroecology policies at the national or subnational level and also feature agroecology as a primary agricultural policy in the nationally determined contributions. These are Uruguay, Venezuela, Mexico, and Burundi. The relative underrepresentation of agroecology in the NDCs made me think about the ways in which agroecology policy entrepreneurs could potentially influence the adoption, submission, and implementation of agroecology as a climate change adaptation and mitigation policy in future NDC submission processes. There are several leverage points at which policy entrepreneurs could engage in the NDC creation process and serve to further integrate agroecology into both national and international policies. This is important because there is a concern that international policy agreements, such as the nationally determined contributions, aren't necessarily being implemented on the ground, even in the countries that have posited these NDCs as a means of identifying their climate commitments. And it's very important that there is coherence amongst the agreements that are being put forward as part of the Paris Agreement and the policies that are being put in place on the ground in the countries in order to ensure that climate commitments are being met over the long term. So by finding ways in which policies that are in place on the national level can be adopted and included in future NDC submissions, this will ensure that policies are being enacted that can clearly and accurately represent countries' ambition and future plans to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. Because agroecology offers such a wide range of holistic solutions that can respond to, adapt, and mitigate climate change, it represents a critical feature of climate-responsive policymaking that should be considered as a primary means of both national policymaking and also inclusion into international policy agreements through the nationally determined contributions. And there are many opportunities for continued engagement in the NDC creation process, and as countries move to create more policy coherence between their international commitments and the policies that are taking place on the ground in their countries, there are many ways in which these policies can be integrated in ways that help meet climate change goals and also serve to improve the lives of people all over the world. Thank you to my research supervisors, Dr. Peter McKeown, Dr. Charles Spillane, and Jean-Francois Lecoq, who helped to shape the ideas that led to this project.
Hello everyone, my name is Shema Roberts and my topic is baseline value chain mapping of 3 climate vulnerable crops. This study took the form of case studies to identify climate risks and gender and social pressures acting on stakeholders in the coffee, rice and cotton value chains. Firstly, I would like to thank my NUI Galway supervisors for their diligence in securing a host organization with which I could conduct my research, as well as for their guidance in the research and the drafting of this paper. I would also like to thank my World Resource Institute supervisors and focal points for their guidance during this process. Lastly, I wish to acknowledge my classmates for their willingness to share ideas and for their encouragement. A big high five to all of you. Value chains are threatened by the impacts of climate change. Climate impact studies in value chains have tended to focus solely on climate impacts, leaving out the multiplier effect of climate change on already existing risks. So it is possible that the true vulnerability of value chains has been underestimated. Hence, there is need to carry out baseline value chain mapping to lay foundation for further studies that will determine entry points for building resilience in value chains. This study was qualitative in nature. My data sources were literature reviews and key informant or expert interviews. The scope of this research was country level for the coffee value chain in Colombia and state level for the rice and the cotton value chains. The rice value chain was in Tamil Nadu, India, and the cotton value chain was in Andhra Pradesh in India. The framework used in this study was the World Bank's Rapid Agricultural Supply Chain Risk Assessment Conceptual Framework, or the RAP-AG-RISC in short. It was used to depict the simultaneous flow of value and supply chain flows. It was important to capture this relationship since impacts in the supply chain affect the value chain. Stakeholder nodes within the RAP-AG-RISC conceptual framework were grouped based on the UNDP and FAO's toolkit for agricultural value chain analysis. Lastly, a thematic review of key informant or expert interviews was carried out to assess the overall vulnerability of the value chains and which stakeholders were the most vulnerable per value chain. The stakeholders were grouped as producers, processors, wholesalers, retailers, and consumers. Basically, they were grouped per function. They were further disaggregated into public, private, finance, non-governmental organizations, and multinational companies where these existed. For the most part, the government is a key stakeholder in all of these value chains, but its influence is strongest in the coffee value chain. Research institutions' key roles tend to be the production of varieties suitable for the climate in the study areas and the technical services to assist farmers adapt. Research institutions play other minor roles, such as providing funding to growers. Across all three value chains, multinational companies are associated with exponential profits, while producers receive much smaller margins. In the rice and cotton value chains, multinational companies are mainly involved in the production of genetically superior hybrids, while in the coffee value chain, they are heavily involved in the processing and exporting of coffee, much more so than local processors and exporters. Public and private financial institutions exist in all three value chains. However, the coffee value chain has a National Coffee Fund, which is dedicated to coffee policy and price control. For this reason, coffee is more ingrained in the national policy than rice and cotton. Thematic reviews showed that the rice value chain is the most vulnerable to climate risks. This is because stakeholders in the rice value chain are affected more than coffee and cotton. The impacts in rice value chain are factual, unlike in the coffee and cotton where there were speculations of impacts. Also, in the coffee and cotton value chains, there are associations of climate change with positive impacts, but not in the rice value chain. Coffee is second in terms of vulnerability. This is because while coffee will experience some positive impacts, it is certain that low-lying coffee-producing areas will become unsuitable for coffee production. The cotton value chain was the least vulnerable. This is because it was associated with fewer threats and minor climate impacts compared to the coffee and the rice value chains. Across the three value chains, growers are the most vulnerable stakeholders. Gender and social issues weaken value chains by limiting the participation of stakeholders in the value addition processes. This results in them having lower margins. As a result, their incomes are too low to allow them to adapt to climate change. Across the value chains under study, smallholders and women are the most recurrent affected groups. Smallholders are vulnerable because they are faced with many challenges because of their low income status. Women are vulnerable due to being marginalized over periods of years due to their societal roles and expectations. Male suicides and child labor issues were unique to the cotton value chain. There are differentiated climate impacts between men and women. Women will face a greater burden from water shortages as they need water for both household duties and farm work. Climate change will increase disparities between men and women and worsen already existing risks. In conclusion, climate change will worsen existing risks and introduce new risks in these value chains. This study discovered that a deeper investigation into value chain stakeholders is required to identify marginal stakeholders and hidden vulnerabilities. It raised the question of what is the aggregate effect of climate risks and gender and social issues on stakeholders within these value chains, considering that climate impact studies normally exclude social issues. Value chain specific and stakeholder specific policy interventions are required. For instance, smallholder farmers will need assistance to switch to climate suitable crops or to move to more productive areas as coffee becomes unsuitable for their farms. In the case of cotton production, strict measures will be required to ensure that cotton is thoroughly treated before being transported to reduce the risk of pest migration from the northern parts of India to the southern parts. In terms of adapting value chains, rice should be prioritized as it is the most vulnerable to climate change. Again, I wish to thank my NUI Galway supervisors for their support, my World Resource Institute supervisors and focal points for their guidance, and last but not least, I wish to thank the Irish Aid, without whose support I would not have been able to study this course. Thank you all so much.
Hello, I'm Ali Seminaire from Albany, New York. I'm presenting the research I completed for the master's thesis in which I examined zoonotic viruses. My project is entitled Zoonosis as a Planetary Boundary to Safeguard Global Health. Zoonotic diseases are illnesses passed from vertebrate animals to humans. There are over 100 viral families in existence, with about 25 of these now known to infect humans. Viruses are just a portion of the numerous zoonotic pathogens that can infect humans, and it also includes bacteria, fungi, parasites, and protozoa. Due to increasing population growth, globalization, urbanization, and a growing demand for natural resources, humans are increasingly invading natural habitats and coming into closer contact with reservoirs of pathogens. Population growth leads to rise in demand for food and land to grow crops and raise livestock, which leads to agricultural expansion. To meet these demands, food production has intensified, which sometimes places output over safety and in turn crowds animals. This crowding stresses the live animals and assists in the spread of pathogens. The spread of diseases from animals to humans typically occurs when there are significant changes in society and the environment. An increased demand for meat, agricultural intensification, mistreatment of wildlife, globalization, the alteration in land use, food supply transformation, and climate change have led to a period of zoonotic disease emergence. The transmission of disease from a host animal to a human usually follows an infect, shed, spill, spread cascade. A spillover event could occur simply by chance, by a first-time exposure, by a duplicated exposure, or by an alteration in the pathogen's genome, which could allow for an infection into a different host. Viruses are shed onto humans constantly, but the infection either never spreads past the first person or it is never detected. Humans have natural barriers like cilia, mucus, antibodies, and an innate immune response which could prevent certain infections. For a virus to effectively spread, it must also efficiently attach to cell receptors, replicate in a new host using that host cell's molecular components, and then pass to another member of that same species. The top 13 zoonotic diseases cause approximately 2.4 billion cases of infection and 2.7 million deaths annually. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which is caused by a zoonotic virus, has killed at least 4.4 million people over the past 1.5 years. These are all clear indicators of the dangers that zoonotic diseases pose and prompt the addition of a 10th planetary boundary to formally classify zoonoses as a threat to the environment and humanity. All of the research for this project was completed remotely. An online literature review and analysis on zoonoses was done, which focused on the global virome, the transmission of zoonoses, the ecological determinants of viral infection and spread, and the mitigation opportunities to reduce the severity of spread. Though this project focused on zoonotic viruses, the proposed planetary boundary included all zoonotic diseases. Although many viruses have been discovered and observed, there are countless others that remain unknown and pose a threat to the human and environmental well-being. Virus emergence occurs when a new virus appears and spreads within a host population, and the incidence of these events are steadily increasing. Viruses are good at infecting populations because they have small genomes, a high mutation rate, and a broad genetic diversity. Zoonotic spillover events are primarily caused by anthropogenic changes in land use for agricultural expansion and is contingent on many factors being in position at the right place and the right time. The transmission of pathogens from animals to humans is considered natural and inevitable. But as the human population increases contact with the environment, this transmission is rising. Though zoonotic diseases are found in wildlife, livestock can also become intermediate hosts for pathogens, as domesticated animals make up 99% of the cases of all emerging zoonosis infections, while wildlife make up just 1%, which may be a surprising fact to some. As the agricultural sector expands, livestock, human, and wildlife contact will also increase. It is projected that the global population will reach 11 billion people by the end of the century. Along with this, it is also predicted that the demand for food will increase and the wealth of the population will rise. Increased wealth increases demand for meat, which impacts the environment due to its sourcing. The increased density of livestock and humans, along with closer contact to wildlife, will lead to a larger prevalence of disease. There are currently 9 defined planetary boundaries, which are a collection of Earth's most critical biophysical subsystems. These subsystems have boundaries or tipping points where a safe operating space can be transgressed with resultant detrimental environmental impacts. The loss in biodiversity boundary is significantly threatened and closely linked with many of the other boundaries. Reduced biodiversity has led to an increase in zoonotic diseases because of intensive agricultural practices, expansion of agriculture, increased livestock biomass, and a rise in contact with wildlife due to land use change. The decrease in biodiversity causes the ecosystem's resilience to decline and become more vulnerable to disease. Zoonotic viruses pose a threat to public health, as displayed by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The risks of zoonotic viruses depend on many things, including the transmission pathway, the host species, environmental stressors, susceptibility, and the volume of the pathogen. Increasing a safe operating space for humanity around zoonotic viruses is imperative because if certain biophysical thresholds are crossed, there could be a detrimental impact on humanity. Defining zoonotic disease as a planetary boundary allows for quantitative and qualitative measurements of acceptable ranges for zoonotic transmission. A quantitative measurement for zoonotic disease thresholds could include the reproductive number, R0, which is the ability of a pathogen to spread among a population. If an R0 is less than 1, this indicates that a disease will die out in a population, while an R0 greater than 1 means that a disease will spread. To keep the contagion to a minimum, a reproductive number, or R0, less than 1 is necessary for a safe limit, and anything over this is a cause for concern. In a highly connected globe, where humans and environmental interactions are increasing and causing climate to change, the occurrence of pandemics is likely to become more common. A focus needs to shift to mitigation and adaptation options to prevent future pandemics. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced the world to create a response to a global viral threat and allowed for the opportunity to develop a management system for the next pathogen. To improve health and decrease the incidence of zoonosis, there needs to be an incentive to reduce global meat consumption by promoting a more nutritious diet. An increase in meat consumption will expand agricultural production along with the spread of infectious diseases and ecological consequences. Educating the public and establishing price controls on certain meats could lead to a decrease in the demand for meat, which would also help create a healthy population and environment. Intensified agriculture has also led to housing animals in confined spaces, which proliferates the spread of disease. To combat this, the livestock are often given antibiotics. However, the overuse of these leads to antimicrobial resistance. This consequentially increases pathogen spread and spillover of diseases to humans.
There must be stricter laws and surveillance regarding commercial livestock production and care, along with a monitoring system to survey antibiotic use and hygienic practices. Fresh markets are thought to be a home to zoonotic pathogens. These markets must become more hygienic and regulated so that wild animals known for carrying diseases can be banned. Lastly, a One Health approach may be vital in managing and preventing zoonotic outbreaks. Prioritizing human, environmental, and animal health can lead to a healthier planet. To allow for this, there must be widespread, accurate education about zoonotic diseases and prevention methods, along with extensive vaccination and antibiotic and antiviral stewardship, and access to medical care for all countries. Though pathogen spillover is natural, it is abnormally increasing due to human-induced changes. More research must be completed to substantiate the possibility of defining zoonotic diseases as a planetary boundary. Additional studies on dietary transition and policy regulation design may also be necessary to advance information on zoonotic diseases. In conclusion, as zoonotic diseases are very relevant and at the forefront of many people's minds, it is necessary to use this momentum to create a boundary for zoonosis that can improve global health. I'd like to lastly thank my advisors, Dr. Charles Spillane and Dr. Peter McGowan, for their continued guidance and support over the time of this project. Thank you also to my classmates at the MScCCAFS program and to those of you listening.
Hello, my name is Liz Coleman, and I'm a lecturer here in the School of Physics and a researcher that specialises in climate and air pollution modelling in the Rhine Institute Centre for Climate and Air Pollution Studies, also in NUIG. So I would first of all like to extend a very warm welcome to the incoming master's students and say how much I'm looking forward to meeting with you all and working with you over the coming weeks and months. And I'd also like to offer my congratulations to the students that have just completed the Masters. So well done on a very impressive performance during a very challenging time. So I lecture in the science behind climate change. So during the course, we discuss how the climate has always been changing. So natural climate change, could talk about Earth system interactions, the natural greenhouse effect, but also how anthropogenic activity has impacted the climate over the past few hundred years, because it's now unequivocal that human activity since the Industrial Revolution has caused the rapid climate change that we are seeing evidence of today. So we're going to describe climate models. These are the tools that are used to synthesize our current knowledge on climate and Earth system and simulate possible scenarios into the future. We're going to discuss the strengths and limitations of these models, knowledge gaps, unknowns that exist in climate models, and crucially how to interpret climate model data and how climate model projections can be used to inform policy. So overall, I'm going to aim to deliver a sound basis into the science of climate change, imparting the necessary information, understanding, and language that is necessary to engage stakeholders across all levels, from community to international policy levels. So armed with this scientific knowledge, you'll be able to work for climate solutions from mitigation of our impact on the climate system to solutions for adaptation and resilience. So once again, good luck to both the incoming and the outgoing MSc students, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the symposium.
Hello everyone, my name is Daria Solchenko, and for my MScCAFS thesis project, I have written a country profile report on assessing the evidence, migration, environment, and climate change in Ireland. The partner organization for this project is the International Organization for Migration, IOM, in Ireland. The structure of this presentation is as follows. Firstly, I will introduce the objectives and motivations behind this project. Secondly, I will outline the methodology and scope that has guided the report. Next, I will briefly outline the key points of the main 3 chapters of the report. And lastly, I will end with the takeaway conclusions. To begin, the migration, environment, and climate change, or MEC nexus, is increasingly discussed and reported on in the global context. Migration is widely used as an adaptation strategy to climate risks and environmental degradation. However, the current and future challenges and opportunities associated with the MEC nexus are under-researched in the Irish context. In response, the motivations for this report and the main aims are to 1. Clarify these relationships by examining vulnerabilities and opportunities associated with climate change. 2. Identify current policy frameworks where climate change and human migration intersect. 3. Recognize information and policy gaps. And 4. Suggest further policy and research development. All of this hopes to allow for a better understanding of and support to those most vulnerable, to contribute to the creation of durable migration support networks, and to contribute to informing migration policies moving forward by including the dimensions of climate change and environment within their scope. These examples from the media represent how the MEC nexus is often portrayed in public discourse. With the left articles depicting how climate adversities may influence internal patterns, such as households retreating inland or families calling on the government to buy them out and relocate them to dry land, or the articles on the right, which reflect how international migration patterns may shift, with claims that Ireland may be a lifeboat or magnet for people fleeing climate risks. However, these statements are not robustly captured in the policy and research dimensions, and these informational gaps are critical to examine, since without the proper data to back these claims and identify where the main challenges lie, it is difficult to influence policy that supports those who are vulnerable to increasing risks in Ireland, or how to ensure protection for those fleeing risks internationally without also overwhelming Irish capacities and creating new vulnerabilities. The methodology and scope of this report was informed by review of existing resources, policies, and practices that address migration, climate change, and vulnerability factors in Ireland. As many of these did not explicitly acknowledge the dimensions of the MEC nexus, the resources were cross-referenced where overlaps were identified. This allowed for a better understanding of the MEC nexus in Ireland and established a starting point for discussing the many ways in which it could potentially evolve. The table of contents of the report was guided by existing IOM MEC country profiles, such as the ones seen on the right. And if published, Ireland would be the first European country to have such a profile. Guided by these resources, the scope was defined to how different forms of internal and international human migration pathways are and could be affected by climate change. The first chapter is on the background and national context, and this chapter serves as a sort of guiding framework for the rest of the report. Firstly, a few socioeconomic and demographic contexts are discussed for how they may create disproportionate vulnerabilities or opportunities. Ultimately, these may determine the decision to or capability of utilizing migration to adapt in the face of climate change and environmental adversities. Next, the Migration and Migrants section offers a brief overview of why people come to Ireland and the many migration experiences in Ireland. These are used to then discuss how climate change may influence existing migration pathways, or how new pathways may emerge as a result of expanding climate risks. The section also discusses how migrants themselves are often vulnerable. Next, the Population Overview section discusses current internal and international population patterns that have been observed and those that are projected for the future. Using these baselines, the report urges that to better understand the causes of these patterns, there needs to be the inclusion of climate change and environmental factors as potential forces that influence these movements. And lastly, the MEC nexus is observed in an Irish history context. Motivated by a few key resources, this section discusses how past uses of migration as adaptation have been employed in Ireland, arguing that the MEC nexus is not an unfamiliar or new phenomenon. In the second chapter, the key challenges of the MEC nexus are connected. The current and projected sudden and slow onset events in Ireland, such as changes in precipitation patterns, flooding, extreme storms, sea level rise, coastal erosion, higher temperatures, droughts, and heat waves, are observed for their specific connections to how they may influence where people live, work, and how people move based on increasingly risky or advantageous circumstances. This section also discusses how slow and sudden onset events have different impacts on migration patterns. Next, the main sectors, livelihoods, and locations are discussed for how they are vulnerable to these effects and how this may influence where people live, work, and how they move. These include agriculture and livestock sectors and livelihoods, marine and fisheries, critical infrastructure, tourism and hospitality, along with socioeconomic vulnerabilities such as gender, age, migrant status, income groups, and lastly, locations in urban, rural, and coastal areas, and how their different vulnerabilities and interdependencies may influence migration patterns. One of the resources to visually represent these risks are observed on the right. These maps look at the land projected to be below annual flood level by 2050, with the red areas indicating land underwater in Dublin, Cork, Clare and Limerick, and Galway. And then lastly, the third chapter ties all of this together by establishing prospects for evidence-based policymaking. And for it to be evidence-based, policy needs to be supported by accurate and reliable data. So firstly, the chapter begins by analyzing existent relevant policy frameworks, such as climate action and resilience, disaster risk management and reduction, land use planning and development, and housing policy and programs. These assist in preventing the need for migration to begin with, even if this is not explicitly stated within their scope. However, with growing risks, migration may be unavoidable and already is in many global contexts and growing Irish contexts, thus spurring the need for policies that go beyond avoiding risks. Well-managed migration policies are needed to not overwhelm Irish capacities for supporting growing populations, and while also supporting migration when necessary so that it can be a viable adaptation strategy. And so the second section observes overlaps among climate and migration policies. For example, the IOM Ireland country strategy has a specific connection to these challenges, while policies such as our Rural Future and the National Adaptation Framework may benefit from exploring the MEC-nexus more explicitly. In terms of EU policies, such as the European Green Deal or the European Skills Agenda, these may determine how people internationally move to seek opportunities in climate adaptation or mitigation jobs, which has an indirect connection to the MEC-nexus. And lastly, the UN has a number of frameworks that deal directly with themes associated with the MEC-nexus, such as the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. And for the final section, research needs and policy options are identified and can be broadly summarized by the need for further evidence, coordination, and collaboration, the need for preparing for and understanding future migration patterns, the need for improving approaches to planned relocation, and finally, the need to bridge policy gaps and mainstream migration into climate change policies and vice versa. An example of the need for further research can be depicted by this graph, which contains data obtained from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. While this data is some of the only existing evidence identified that details such numbers and processes, it fails to capture detailed localized assessments, and it only accounts for sudden onset disaster displacement. Some potential improvements that this report has flagged is the need for more data generation on how long, where to, where from, by which event, and exactly who's being displaced, the inclusion of slow onset displacement, which can be harder to measure or capture through data, disaggregated socioeconomic, demographic, and livelihood factors, and the consideration of the wide spectrum of human mobility, such as planned relocation processes, which are of great relevance in Ireland in particular. Nonetheless, this sort of data offers a useful stepping point for going forward and including more measures of human mobility pathways as they relate to environmental and climate changes. And finally, to conclude, overall, existing policies on migration and climate change in Ireland lack integration. So, future work should address how these challenges intersect and how acknowledging their connections would better support those affected and provide greater insight into well-managed migration practices. This study suggests policy actions should be taken to ensure positive measures for migration as adaptation, greater efforts towards planned and participatory relocation for vulnerable locations, sectors, and livelihoods, and the bolstering of climate adaptation and mitigation efforts in order to avert future displacement to the extent possible, both globally and in Ireland. The outcome of the report has been the identification of several research recommendations and policy options based on the evidence and on the gaps in information. To end this presentation, I'd like to thank the following people and organizations that made this project happen. Firstly, thank you to my NUI Galway supervisors, Professors Charles Spillane, Dr. Una Murray, and Dr. Peter McCune. Host institution supervisors from IOM Ireland, Andrew Chisholm, John McJogan, and Lalini Virasamy, and others involved in the project. Sunya Deep Banerjee from IOM, Deborah Miranda from IOM Ireland, and Dr. Daniel Tubridy from University College Dublin. Lastly, I'd like to thank IOM Ireland for their funding, resources, and support for the drafting and researching of the country profile. Thank you all for listening.
Hello everyone, my name is Joseph Teig. For my research project, I wrote a review paper on how emission mitigation strategies affect animal welfare. The paper was titled Animal Welfare, Co-Benefits and Trade-offs of Emission Mitigation in Ruminant Livestock. So in summary, my review paper was about how do emission mitigation strategies affect animal welfare. So the first thing I had to do was I had to identify how to measure animal welfare. Now this is done by identifying the 4 indicators of animal welfare. They are behavioural, so the animal's not showing its usual behaviour, it's isolating, ear posture. Then there's physical, which could be an injury, swelling of joints. Then there's physiological, reduced feed intake from the animal. And finally there's production, which is reduced growth, poor body condition, and poor reproduction rates. So once I was able to measure animal welfare, I then moved on to the next step, which was to discuss emission mitigation strategies. There's 3 main mitigation strategies. Feed additives, which is products you can feed an animal that reduce the buildup of methane in the rumen. Then there's breeding strategies. And then finally there's animal husbandry practices, which is just generally good practice, reduce cases of disease, and they lead to more productive animals. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, all my research was done from home. My main method throughout the project was endless amounts of reading around the subjects of animal welfare, livestock ruminants, and emission mitigation strategies. For my research findings regards feed additives, 3-NOP had the biggest potential. It greatly reduced methane production in all livestock ruminants and also appeared to have no negative effects on animal welfare. While breeding strategies can be very effective in emission mitigation, there is a fine line. It is important not to breed for production over reproduction, as this can lead to welfare issues such as lameness and mastitis in high-yielding dairy cows. This is an area of study that is still very much in its infancy. There is very little policy in place between animal welfare and emission mitigation strategies. When I looked through the NDCs, Tonga was the only country that mentioned animal welfare on their NDC to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There is an exciting future ahead, but a lot more testing of these strategies and products is needed in this field before its full potential can be realised. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank my NUI Galway supervisors, Professor Charles Spillane and Dr. Peter McCune, for all the help and guidance they gave me throughout the year and on this project. And I'd also like to thank my Teagasc supervisor, Professor Sinead Waters, for all her help in guiding me through this research project.